By the 17th of August 1942, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army hadn't moved for several days. Here they had to stop due to a fuel shortage. A fuel shortage so severe that they decided to make the problem worse by giving Hoth 2 additional divisions to supply, the 297th Infantry and the 24th Panzer Divisions. That makes sense, doesn't it, Hapt? Anyway, 24th Panzer Division had just arrived to reinforce Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. For now, though, they were kept behind the lines so as to keep their presence unknown to the Soviets. But to the men of the division, it felt like they were in Africa, not Russia. The treeless steppe gave no protection from the sun, and the men were so hot that they stripped down to their boots and underwear, and in at least one case, blue swimming trunks. However, there was no relaxing for the other troops in the 4th Panzer Army. Once again, German artillery and Stukas pounded the Soviet positions before 29th Motorized and 94th and 371st Infantry Divisions went onto the attack at 0330 hours. The 15th Motorized Infantry Regiment, supported by 129th Panzer Battalion, sliced between the 550th and 690th Rifle Regiments, encircled the 550th and 366th Rifle Regiments, and forced Colonel Sorokin and his headquarters to withdraw. Stukas buzzed overhead, offering strong support to the ground troops below. And at this point, Sorokin got permission from the 64th Army to use 208th Rifle Division's Katyushas and artillery, and ordered the 690th Rifle Regiment and a regiment of cadets to counterattack and get his encircled forces out. The 6th Guards Tank Brigade also tried to relieve the situation, but had little choice but to advance over open ground, where they were greeted by shells from German panzers and tank destroyers, and 14 Soviet tanks were soon ablaze. But the 94th Infantry Division had failed to take Abganyerovo Station by the early afternoon. So, Kempf ordered 29th Motorized Division to attack the station with panzers that evening. The fatigued German infantry, supported by the 129th Panzer Battalion, went forwards. However, faced with a formidable defence of the fortified station, their attack petered out at 1930 hours. Even so, Soviet units in the area were on their last legs. 208th Rifle Division, still defending the station, reported that their division had just 1,678 men left, less than the strength of a rifle regiment. And in what was clearly now exposed positions, Chuikov had been ordered to withdraw his group, which he does overnight on the 17th and 18th of August to avoid harassment by the Luftwaffe. At first, the Romanian 20th Infantry Division didn't seem to realise that Chuikov's group had withdrawn. Rearguards kept up the impression that they were still on the Axei, but eventually the Romanians did realise and moved up on the 18th of August 1942. Looking at the broad picture though, the Germans clearly had the advantage, and had regained the initiative in both 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army's area, although the main cost had been time. The main outcome of the July-August battles in the Great Bend of the Don was that the plan of the German command to take control of Stalingrad and then Astrakhan and the entire lower Volga was completely foiled. It was torn down by the efforts of all the armies, which at the beginning of these battles constituted one and then two fronts. Even though Paulus had finally succeeded, it had taken him a month to clear the western bank of the Don, and rather than complete this task in one go, Paulus had to conduct several distinct and separate offensives to do it. In addition, substantial reinforcements had been needed for Paulus to conduct these offensives, including the shift of 4th Panzer Army to his southern flank. And Soviet forces had been far more resilient than Hitler, the OKH or Army Group B had anticipated. So far, 6th Army had destroyed 3 Soviet armies, the 21st, 28th and 38th, in the early stages of the Faulblau campaign. But in July and August, it had faced 5 more armies, 21st, 62nd, 63rd Armies and 1st and 4th Tank Armies. After destroying or severely damaging 3 of these, 62nd Army and the 1st and 4th Tank Armies, it still faced 5 Soviet armies in the area: 63rd, 21st, 1st Guards, 4th Tank and 62nd Armies. 3 of these were battered, but they were still in the field. And worse, by this point, the panzer divisions of both Paulus's and Hoth's forces were down to less than 50% in strength. This was why the Axis allied armies were being brought up to the Don area to free up German units along the Don for the next march towards Stalingrad. And in fact, it was on the 17th of August 1942 that Hitler and Halder discussed the idea of forming a completely new army group in the Stalingrad region. This would consist of the 6th Army and 2 Romanian armies on the flanks, one to the west of Stalingrad and one to the south. Of course, a new Romanian army would have to be created in order to do that, since 4th Panzer Army only had 1 corps of Romanian troops within it. But it is clear that, even at this stage, Hitler and Halder both recognised the need to reinforce the area against stiff Soviet opposition. It's also probably an acknowledgement that they had stretched their forces too thin, and that the solution here wasn't just to reinforce Army Group B. The fact that they wanted to create an entirely new Army Group headquarters does suggest that von Weichs was having enough to deal with already, and perhaps couldn't cope with the armies he already had. An influx of additional armies may have been too much for one Army Group commander to command. So, a new army group was needed. And if this is the case, if von Weichs was overstretched at this point, dealing with 2 strategic axes instead of 1, and coordinating the efforts of Hungarian, Italian and Romanian troops, a total of 5 armies, including the largest German army in the east, the 6th Army, then this might be an additional reason as to why the Battle of Stalingrad didn't go so well. Well, jumping ahead slightly, on the 20th of August, Hitler met with Romanian leader Conducător Ion Antonescu and offered him command of a new army group, Army Group Don. This Army Group Don would consist of the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, the 4th not yet created, Paulus's 6th Army, and possibly 4th Panzer Army as well. It would also only form after the fall of Stalingrad, not before, so Antonescu would be spared having to fight for every inch of ground in the city. In this proposal, Paulus would become Antonescu's deputy, bearing in mind that Paulus's wife was a Romanian aristocrat, so this wasn't an unreasonable suggestion. And Antonescu had commanded an army group in 1941, Army Group Antonescu, so he was an experienced general. In the end, Antonescu did accept Hitler's offer, but because Stalingrad never fell, Antonescu never took up his command. And it turns out that he was too ill at the time anyway. But if this had happened, this would have been a very interesting development. Still, this is further evidence that Army Group B was stretched too thin, and that, perhaps, von Weichs was overburdened by his responsibilities. The fact that Hitler and the Wehrmacht were having to increasingly rely upon their Axis allies was also a warning sign. Romanian armies, for example, were not the same as a German army. Their divisions were actually smaller than German divisions, containing only 6 infantry battalions rather than 9, and were about the same size as a Soviet division. They were armed with an assortment of different weapons from many different countries: Czech weapons, German weapons, French weapons, captured Soviet weapons, and even some Polish weapons too. The Romanian army in 1942 technically had more light machine guns, mortars, artillery and anti-tank guns than ever before, but their divisions were still woefully under-equipped, and their reduced size from 1941 onwards meant that they were pretty weak formations. Their main anti-tank guns were of the inadequate 47mm caliber, again from several different nations. And while their artillery were armed with armor-piercing shells, the low velocity of their howitzers meant that they were only about as effective as their anti-tank guns. These anti-tank guns had already proven themselves to be inefficient in dealing with Soviet medium and heavy tanks. And in September 1942, Antonescu himself estimated that a typical Romanian infantry division was only about 2/3 as powerful as a German infantry division. Such weaknesses, coupled with the fact that the advance in the south was slowing, seemed to have heightened tensions within the German high command. Hitler and Halder were already frustrated by the lack of Soviet prisoners taken during the Foul-Blau campaign, and while they had taken Mayakop, progress had slowed in the Caucasus. By early August 1942, it was clear that Axis forces had been stretched too thin, as was Hitler. Beneath the facade, Hitler's nerves were edgy. His anxiety about the offensive was growing. On the 22nd, news reached him that a small team of German mountain troops had climbed the highest mountain in the Caucasus, Mount Elbrus, and had planted the swastika at its peak. Rather than being impressed or amused, Hitler burst into a murderous rage. The troops presumably thought he would be pleased. In fact, he was furious at what he saw as a pointless mountaineering feat devoid of military purpose. Speer later wrote that he had seldom seen him so enraged, fuming for days at these mad mountaineers who deserved to be put before a military court. It was as if they had ruined his entire operational plan. And the Germans hadn't even reached Stalingrad yet. On the 18th, for the first time in 3 weeks, the rain fell on the battlefield. During this downpour, Generals Hauenschelt, Kempf and Heim start to develop the next attack plan. Hauenschelt was an experienced commander who had fought at the Somme, Artois and Cambrai, suffering several wounds during the First World War. He had commanded numerous units up to this point in the war, including 10th Panzer Division, and had been awarded the Knight's Cross on the 25th of August 1941. Now, Hauenschelt informed Kempf that there wasn't enough fuel or grease for his division's 94 tanks, and the offensive would have to be delayed. He knew that his panzers could have difficulties because they relied on the grease to keep their tracks in running order. In this dry, dusty environment, it was more important than ever to keep the tracks and running wheels properly lubricated. There was also a lack of fuel. But Kempf dismissed the idea of a long delay and dished out orders for the attack to start on the 20th. Hoth's plan was for Kempf's 48th Panzer Corps, with the 14th and 24th Panzer and 29th Motorized Divisions, to attack northwest and move into Stalingrad's southern suburbs. 4th Army Corps, with the 94th, 371st and 297th Infantry Divisions, would advance northeast and then northwest to link up with the 6th Army, which would be coming towards them from the northwest. And the Romanian 6th Army Corps' 20th, 1st, 2nd and 4th Infantry Divisions were tasked with containing and destroying the 64th Army in what was hoped would be a large pocket west of Stalingrad once Pallas's forces had launched their own attack. The problem was that 1/3 of Hoth's army consisted of these low-quality Romanian infantry divisions. With these, Hoth had to take on a Soviet force with more men than 4th Panzer Army had overall. Yes, his 200 panzers did outnumber the enemy's tanks 2-1, but the fact that his tank numbers included some out-of-date models, such as the lightly armed and armoured Panzer IIs, this wasn't going to be an easy ride. The main spearhead for Hoth's army was the 24th Panzer Division. This would advance on the right wing of his army, reach the lake area, then move north towards Stalingrad. So, Hauenschelt issued his orders for the attack, splitting his division into various battle groups in order to complete their objectives. The main Kampfgruppe, which was Kampfgruppe Broik, had almost all the panzers of the division and most of 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment as well, and was situated to the north of the main attack route. A secondary Kampfgruppe, commanded by von Edelsheim, with infantry and artillery, was positioned to the south. There was also Kampfgruppe Hellermann with his motorcycles and Kampfgruppe Salzer's tank destroyers. As this preparation for Hoth's attack was going on, a rocket barrage pummeled the German lines. Then, at 0700 hours, Sorokin attacked again, this time with 3 battalions plus tanks. These attacks did little, and the 94th and 371st Infantry Divisions cut the pocket in two in the morning. Worse for the Soviets, the 71st Infantry Regiment and the 129th Panzer Battalion managed to take Abganyerovo Station, which was good news for the Germans because Kempf needed this area in order to advance further towards Stalingrad. At this point, Schwiedler of 4th Army Corps asked Kempf if Kempf could give Schwiedler's troops some panzer support. Our panzers cannot be everywhere, and our panzers are not there to intervene in urban combat. Well, as Jason D. Mark points out, it was a dictum that would ring hollow several weeks later. To the north, the Germans continued in their attempt to secure a bridgehead over the Don, as fierce Soviet counterattacks tried to drive them back into the water. Several units reinforced this action, and the 76th, 295th, 384th and 389th Infantry Divisions took heavy losses as a result. As reinforcements, Rodenburg was lent the 60th Pioneer Battalion and the 413th Pioneer Regiment, consisting of the 652nd Pioneer Battalion and the 912th Assault Boat Commando. Uthman received the 41st and 45th Motorised Pioneer Battalions as well from the 605th Motorised Pioneer Regiment. And Seydlitz had even more engineer units in reserve, including the 604th Motorised Pioneer Regiment, consisting of the 672nd Pioneer and the 655th Bridge Construction Battalions. This quite clearly shows the level of determination that the 6th Army had at this stage for a river crossing over the Don. One of the labourers assigned to the bridgehead described the situation. The Russians attacked in a tremendous manner, with tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. With the rocket launchers, they shot directly at us and scored plenty of hits. We had to get out. We had no infantry experience at all, and if it hadn't been for our own infantry, the Russians would have grabbed us by the throat. We saw tanks coming at us. Next to us was a flak in a house. We hadn't seen it at all, it was camouflaged so well. It fired its shots, the turrets flew off, and 3 tanks were knocked out. That was the first time I was really scared. The Russians came, some on top of the tanks, and then they ran towards us and shouted, "Hurrah!" As this was going on, the rest of the 6th Army consolidated their positions in the Don Bend, while Du Bois' 44th Infantry Division was marching into the area to take over 60th Motorised Division's lines. 19th of August 1942. There was a strong wind from the east and the sky was overcast. To the south, the Soviet pockets were wiped out this morning and the Germans secured the area. Meanwhile, throughout the day, the 24th Panzer Division and other units moved to their attack positions, ready for the next day's offensive. They suffered a minor setback when the 50th Rifle Regiment of the 15th Guards Rifle Division attacked in the afternoon, surrounding a company from the 4th Kradschützen Battalion. Hauenschelt launched a counterattack and beat Ovsienko's division back, freeing his trapped motorcycle men. Much further north, Paulus issued his orders for the strike towards Stalingrad, an attack which would begin for his army on the 21st, whilst Hoth would launch his own attack a day earlier on the 20th. 6th Army's plan was relatively simple. Seydlitz's 51st Army Corps, with the 2 divisions that had suffered the least casualties so far, the 76th and 295th, would cross and seize a bridgehead over the Don at and around Pestrovitka and Vertiachi, assisted by Langermann's 24th Panzer Corps, which only had 1 division at this point, the 71st Infantry Division. Weitersheim's 14th Panzer Corps, with 16th Panzer Division and the 3rd and 60th Motorized Divisions, would then cross the Don before driving eastward along the high ground north of the Roshoshka River. They would strike into the region north of Stalingrad, reach the western bank of the Volga River, and in the process carve a corridor that stretched back to the Don. As this was happening, Seydlitz's force would move southeast to fight their way into the city of Stalingrad itself. Then these forces would link up with Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which would be advancing from the south. Heitz's 8th Army Corps was tasked with protecting the northern flank with the 305th, 384th and 389th Infantry Divisions. The success of both Paulus's and Hoth's plans would depend on how fast they could reach and take the city of Stalingrad. They had to take it on the march, otherwise the Soviets would throw more units into battle, slowing their offensive down and grounding away their strength through attrition. But Colonel Adam expressed his concern that the Soviet High Command would surely know that they were going to be heading towards Stalingrad from this direction. The Soviets had had plenty of time to prepare, and this attack would not be a surprise. And while Paulus did have a similar sized force as he'd had for his previous offensive, a significant portion of his army was going to be sitting on his Don flank, watching the river and the Soviet bridgeheads, whilst assisting Axis Allied forces that were moving into that area. This fact reduced Paulus's initial attacking force to just 1 panzer, 2 motorized and 3 infantry divisions. Unlike Operation Nord, this was not going to be an overwhelming force, and is more evidence that Axis forces were simply stretched too thin. Although it is often claimed that the Battle of Kalach had finally cleared the Don Bend, that was not the case. There were still a number of pesky Soviet bridgeheads on Paulus's northern left flank. Half-hearted attempts to reduce them came to nothing. He had neither the time nor the forces to spare against each one, and he had more important business to the east. One lesson that the Wehrmacht would learn and relearn repeatedly in this war was that failing to crush a Soviet bridgehead almost always had deleterious consequences later on. This would be no exception. In the Zoritsa Gorge, Andrei Yeremenko agonized over the obvious build-up going on in Paulus's sector. Intelligence showed that the Germans were planning another classic pincer movement, with 6th Army acting as the left arm and Hoth's 4th Panzers as the right. This wasn't strictly true, although the Soviets may have believed it. Paulus's primary aim was to get to the Volga north of Stalingrad, not head south towards Hoth, which would have encircled large portions of 62nd and 64th armies. Still, on the Soviet side of the wire, things were pretty dire. Yeremenko incorrectly guessed that Paulus's forces would attack from the Akatov area rather than the Vertiachi region. He therefore ordered Lopatin's 62nd Army to not only defend along the Don, but also prepare a second line of defence running mostly along the Stalingrad K defensive line. After some tweaks, this secondary defence line was manned by the 87th and 196th Rifle Divisions, plus 1 cadet school, and elements of 115th Fortified Region. Lopatin was also ordered to move Rodin's 28th Tank Corps, plus his artillery and anti-tank units, to the Vertiachi region in order to regroup and strengthen the Stalingrad front's right wing. As a testament to the heavy fighting of the previous battles, Rodin's 28th Tank Corps was now reformed, becoming the 182nd Tank Brigade. But even reduced to brigade level, it was still under strength. So much so that, until it had time to reconstruct itself and receive replacements, the Soviet command deemed Rodin's brigade to be too weak for use in battle. There was also the 18th Rifle Division, which, on the 20th of August, had just 1,281 men left, with one heavy machine gun. Yet, despite this, it was stationed right opposite the German bridgehead over the Don. Yeremenko also believed that if he launched strong counterattacks against 6th Army's flank from the Stalingrad front's centre and right wing, these could stall Paulus's attack or perhaps prevent it from getting to Stalingrad entirely. He therefore ordered Lopatin to form 2 shock groups and employ them in positions ready for a joint counterattack on the river at Akatov. The first shock group, set up in the Fastov area, consisted of the 35th Guards Rifle Division, the 169th Tank Brigade, and 2 anti-tank regiments. The second group sat in the Kotluban region and was made up of the 214th Rifle Division, the 32nd Motorized Rifle Brigade, and 40th and 134th Tank Brigades. The 40th Tank Brigade had been restored from its previous fighting and now had 3 KVs, 29 T-34s and 2 T-60s at its disposal. And the 134th Tank Brigade, commanded by Tikhonchuk, was armed with US Lend-Lease tanks. These were 19 Lee M3 medium tanks and 32 Stuart M3 light tanks. While they could be classed as good light tanks, the Stuarts were inferior to the Panzer IIIs in both armour and firepower, and couldn't make up for the German superiority in combined arms tactics, as we have seen in our previous Battlestorm series, Operation Crusader in 1941. The Soviets weren't fond of them, and considering that they made up the majority of the tanks here, the 134th Tank Brigade wasn't going to be terribly effective in combat. However, the M3 medium tanks were armed with a 75mm gun, which outranged the Panzer III's 50mm, and had impressed Rommel when they first arrived in North Africa. They were definitely superior to the Soviet T-60s and T-70s at the very least. The problem was that the 75mm gun of the Lee was attached in a side sponson, limiting its traverse on the battlefield. Worse, the high profile meant that the tank was an easy target. The commander found it difficult to target 2 tanks at the same time with the 2 guns. It couldn't go into hull-down position and use the 75mm gun at the same time. If it was hit, the rivets inside the tank would fly about inside, wounding the operators. Plus, it had a tendency to catch fire when hit, and its off-road performance wasn't great. The Soviets weren't particularly happy with the Lee, describing it as a grave for 7 brothers, and with many of the Panzer IVs now armed with long-barreled 75mm guns, and the fact that the Germans made effective use of the 88mm flak guns, which would rip the Lee to shreds at long distances, the small number of M3 mediums that were fielded here couldn't hope to offset the German combined arms advantage at this time. And this proved correct in practice as well as in theory. The Soviets launched counterattacks against the German bridgehead on the 19th of August, which included the 134th Tank Brigade. The reason for this counterattack was that the Stavka continued to demand action from Yeremenko. So he ordered a general counterattack to begin on the 19th, to be conducted with the 1st Guards, 4th Tank, 21st, 62nd and 63rd Armies. All of these would assault Axis lines in an effort to stall the incoming attack. However, not only did Yeremenko overestimate the strength of his own forces, but the 6th Army had acted first anyway, by destroying 4th Tank Army's positions in the Great Don Bend. So this convinced the Soviets that this desperate counterattack wouldn't achieve much even if it did go in. Instead, Soviet forces were mostly placed on the defensive, apart from Moskalenko's 1st Guards Army, which would take some territory south of the Don, and the 62nd Army's attempt to destroy the German bridgehead over the Don. In the end, this attack by 2 Guards Rifle regiments, the 214th Rifle Division and the 134th Tank Brigade, resulted in a lot of tank losses. The German 384th Infantry Division claimed to have taken out 30 Soviet tanks, although the Soviet records are incomplete, so it's hard to confirm that claim. Still, given the inferiority of the M3 light tanks and the desperate nature of the Soviet counterattacks at this time, it's not an unreasonable figure. The Stavka had also released the 23rd, 84th and 298th Rifle and 27th Guards Rifle Divisions on the 18th of August, which were due to arrive on the 22nd of August. But despite all these preparations, on the 19th of August, 6th Army's main assault force of 6 divisions only faced 5 weak rifle divisions from 4th Tank and 62nd Armies along the Don. So, despite the problems facing Paulus, there was still a reasonable chance of success at this time, at least in the initial stages of the attack. Facing Hoth's incoming attack, Shumilov's 64th and Tolbukin's 57th armies prepared their defences. It was at this moment that Chuikov visited 64th Army headquarters. When I arrived to see General Shumilov, I also found there Lieutenant General Golikov, deputy commander of the front. We had a meal together, and I learned that the Front Military Council had already decided to incorporate the troops of the Southern Group into the 64th Army. General Golikov proposed that I should remain with the army as deputy commander. I agreed. So, Chuikov's Southern Operational Group headquarters was now dissolved, and because the units along the Mishkova River were only really facing one Romanian division, it didn't really require as many Soviet forces to hold the area. So the 154th Naval Rifle Brigade and the 138th Rifle Division were moved out of the line and marched east towards Tinguta. This left the 157th Rifle Division, the 118th Fortified Region, 66th Naval Rifle Brigade, and the Zhytomyr and Grozny Officers' School regiments defending the Mishkova and Don rivers. At this point in the Tinguta area sat the 38th, 204th and 126th Rifle Divisions, backed by the 29th Rifle Division. 13th Tank Corps was southeast of Tinguta Station, while the 208th Rifle Division was in reserve. Tolbukin's 57th Army, with the 15th and 36th Guards Rifle Divisions, and the 244th and 422nd Rifle Divisions, a force from the Vinitsa Infantry School Regiment, the 255th Cavalry Regiment, and the 76th Fortified Region defended from Tinguta to Raygorod on the Volga. Tolbukin had no tanks at all, and this force was basically a defensive force with little counterattacking capability. However, one thing that was in the Soviets' favour was Kryochunkin's shattered 4th Tank Army. Now yes, it doesn't really appear that way, considering that it just got split in two during the previous week. But now, with Paulus aiming towards Stalingrad, the situation had changed slightly. 4th Tank Army would continue to hold its bridgehead at Kremenskaya, but now would receive reinforcements of up to 4 new divisions, after which Kryochunkin would then attack southwest into the flank of the 6th Army and increase the size of the bridgehead south of Sirotinskaya. This would set up a staging area for a possible future attack towards the southwest, into 6th Army's rear. There was also Kuznetsov and Danilov's armies further to the west, who were now planning on crossing the Don, and, it was hoped, would put enough pressure on Paulus's flank that he would have to call off his offensive. But otherwise, Yeremenko's battered armies left a lot to be desired when it came to the defence of Stalingrad.